2NURFM 103.7 as we have a look at some of the things happening in the world of education. We do that with our Professor of Education from the University of Newcastle, John Fischetti, who, John, you were wanting to take us back to a time today when we're sort of probably in that adolescent phase and, the time when we knew everything, but sometimes some of the messages not getting through there, and it's kind of a time of change for our brain too.
Absolutely. Good morning, Mark. I've talked to a couple of our listeners in the last 2 weeks, and they were sharing with me their curiosity about what's going on in the brains of their sort of tweens, that era that might be years, 6, 7-ish, when 11 to 14, when young people are going through a transition. We call it adolescence, but going through puberty, and a lot's going on during those years, Mark. Some of us don't remember them because we were caught up in our own growth. But it's a fascinating time of growth and development. And for some of our listeners struggling with kids at that era, really understanding how the brain works, it's phenomenal what we get to do. We're really our own major big-time computers reprogramming ourselves during that era of our lives.
And we know what computers are like. They just work seamlessly all the time. No, they don't. So there are little glitches along the way, and how we learn changes, and we sort of need to sort of adapt to that.
Precisely. So we're born with 100 billion neurons, and we grow that 15,000 a day through the first 3 years of life. So we're a supercomputer early days. We're taking in everything, even if we're not showing we are. And then during the 3 toward year 10, age 10 or 11, we're processing those things and growing. So if we learn a language, we learn our times tables. If we learn to say thank you, if we learn the capital of Australia is Canberra, if we learn those things, we tend then later on, as we go through a transition into more of adult brain, it isn't really adulthood, but the adult brain through puberty.
The start of it, yeah.
And we then can keep them going. But what happens then is the stuff we haven't learned, we prune. And that is the sort of term in neuroscience for we cut it off. So one way to think about this is when I was in high school, we used to write essays, and at university we wrote a lot of essays. But one of our teachers recommended just keep writing and eventually go cut. So get it all down and then make it right. So the brain in the first few years is getting it all down. And then what you don't use, you lose. So if you haven't learned a language by the time you go through adolescence, or you haven't learned even to say thank you, or you haven't learned 2 times 9 is 18, after that period, actually that skill has been lost and it has to be regrown, which is the process called sprouting.
That can be somewhat a depressing thought if we haven't jammed in the basics or the really need to stuff. So we've got to learn it a different way.
And exactly what we need is primary education to get those basics. And then secondary school can't look like worksheets and regurgitation approaches because the brain doesn't work that way. Back a few years ago, they were putting in that new exit on the M1 heading to Sydney around the twin servos, south of Morisset, if you remember, and it was just a mess. I mean, they had them going left, right, over, under. It was always in a standstill. It could take you 4 hours to go to Sydney because you couldn't get through that spot. That's what's happening in the brain as it's trying to gain new. It's like a real mess. So what we have to do in the secondary years is very active, very engaged, very student involved, or it isn't going to happen. So when parents of kids who have gone through the transition toward adulthood, they might be now 14, they say, oh, they're not listening to me, or oh, they don't know, you used to know it. Well, actually what they've done is refine the things they know really well. It's also why athletes who start earlier on coordination, hand-eye coordination skills, it doesn't have to be, they have to have a certain bat in their hand at some point, are always going to be better, because to learn how to bowl, learn how to shoot a free throw or anything else later on, it's really hard. So we have to do primary school so well that as we prune, not as much is pruned, but it doesn't mean we can't. But most teachers aren't thinking they're working with kind of a reduced brain load, because as much as half of that 100 billion is lost in that transition.
That is, I know everyone's at the same boat. We are who we are, and we are designed how we're designed. But that is an interesting point, isn't it? Like, here's what you have, and half of it is going to be, to use the term, pruned and just gone.
Right, and it primarily, as sophisticated as we think we are as humans, we really have a primary purpose as we go through that transition, and that's that we're supposed to reproduce and keep more people on the planet. So we really are intellectual by our own assumption, not by the reality of our biology. So to do that, we got to do secondary school differently. Then we can only learn a language if we're actually speaking it and needing something like I need to find where the train is or where the toilet is, or like I actually need food. Well, we won't learn it conjugating verbs, and how much of language is still taught that way. How much of essay writing is not related to what's interesting to the student. So a lot of the challenge in education isn't whether you're on the right or the left, you're pro or con some philosophy. It's actually, how's the brain actually work in this transition? And the most important years to keep encouraging kids is when they're going through that transition. Imagine if you're going through the pruning and then the growth of these new ideas while your whole body is physically changing into adulthood. So we've got to give kids grace during that time, maybe have a little less expectation of the academic rigor and much more about the guiding them through and the confidence they retain as they're going through big change, the biggest one we go through.
Or, as John, I suppose the point you're making, that we're always become better at things that interest us, so we have to make all the things we learn become more interesting.
That's well said, Mark.
You can phrase that, clean that up a little bit. You can use that out there.
I think you've just written a quality journal article right there.
There we go.
Good job, Mark.
Any money in that?
No, you haven't had everything pruned. It's impressive.
Oh, no money in it. Damn it. John, it's always a pleasure, mate. We'll get you next time, all right?
Thank you, Mark.
The check made out to just me, or to make it out to cash. That'll be even better.
Yeah, we'll try to sprout some of the money for you.
We'll do what we can. All right, there's our Professor of Education from the University of Newcastle, John Fischetti, on 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.